Before you toss another can of tuna in your cart, you should know two separate independent labs have actually tested the most popular brands in America, and what they found explains a lot about why some cans are genuinely fine to eat every week, while others you'd be smart to only eat occasionally, if at all. This isn't a guessing game, a rumor passed around online, or someone's personal opinion about a brand they don't like. Consumer Reports ran a full mercury test across 5 of the biggest tuna brands sold in the United States, checking both the albacore and chunk light versions of each one, and just last year, an independent lab called Consumer Lab tested more than 20 different canned fish products for both mercury and arsenic, publishing the results for anyone to see. The results split almost perfectly down one simple line that most shoppers walking down the tuna aisle have absolutely no idea exists. They're not thinking about it, because nothing on the packaging is designed to make them think about it. Today we're going through what these two real, published investigations actually found, brand by brand, can by can, so that by the end of this video, you know exactly which specific products to think twice about and which ones are genuinely fine to keep buying without a second thought. Stick around, because the answer at the end of all this isn't about avoiding tuna altogether, giving up on an incredibly cheap, convenient source of protein and omega-3s. It's about knowing which 2 words printed right on the front of the label actually matter, and which words are just marketing noise you can safely tune out. Before we start naming brands one by one, here's the one underlying fact you need to understand first, because it genuinely explains almost everything else on this entire list. Tuna doesn't come from one single type of fish. It comes in different species, and it isn't the brand name, the logo, or the price tag that determines how much mercury or arsenic ends up sitting in your bowl. It's the actual species of fish inside that specific can. Albacore, the fish behind every can labeled white tuna or solid white, is a considerably bigger, longer-living fish that sits higher up the ocean food chain, which means over the course of its longer life, it's had far more time and far more opportunities to accumulate mercury by eating smaller fish that already carry some amount of it themselves. That mercury doesn't break down or get filtered out. It just keeps accumulating the longer the fish lives. Skipjack, the smaller fish behind labels that say chunk light or light tuna, is considerably smaller and has a much shorter lifespan, which means it simply hasn't had anywhere near the same amount of time to build up those same elevated levels. Consumer Reports' 2023 testing found that across every single one of the 5 brands they checked, without exception, the albacore version of that brand's tuna averaged roughly 3 times more mercury than that exact same brand's own chunk light version, sitting right next to it on the same shelf. This isn't a comparison between a cheap brand and an expensive one, or a trustworthy company against a sketchy one. It's the exact same company, the same factory, often the same production line, just a different species of fish going into the can. Keep that single fact in your head as we go through this list, because it's going to come up again and again in almost every single entry. We're starting with number 10, or really, tied for the bottom of this list, because this entire next stretch is essentially one lesson told 6 slightly different ways using 6 different real products. Kirkland Signature Albacore Solid White Tuna in Water, Costco's own in-house store brand. A lot of shoppers instinctively assume that a Costco private label product automatically comes with stricter quality control or somehow better sourcing than a national brand, purely because of Costco's overall reputation for bulk value and consistency. But when Consumer Lab ran its 2025 testing on a batch of 6 major albacore tuna products, 5 out of those 6 came in above the 100 microgram arsenic threshold per serving that the lab specifically flags as worth paying attention to, a level that starts genuinely approaching California's Prop 65 warning threshold for the more dangerous, inorganic form of arsenic that makes up roughly 10% of the total arsenic typically found in fish. Kirkland's albacore variety was one of the 6 products sitting in that exact test group. Being a private store label sold at a wholesale club didn't exempt it from the same underlying species-level math that every other product on this list is dealing with in exactly the same way. Wild Planet Albacore Wild Tuna. This is genuinely one of the pricier options you'll find sitting in the tuna aisle, and it's marketed heavily around phrases like wild caught and general sustainability messaging, complete with packaging that leans noticeably more premium than the mainstream brands surrounding it. And to be fair, the actual fishing and sourcing practices behind this brand really are more transparent than what most of the mainstream competition publishes about their own supply chains. But here's the thing worth sitting with for a second. The phrase wild caught describes how the fish was caught, not what species of fish it actually is. Wild Planet's albacore variety was also part of that exact same 6-product albacore batch that Consumer Lab tested in 2025. Paying a noticeably higher price for genuinely better, more transparent sourcing practices doesn't change the underlying fact that it's still albacore sitting inside that can, still the higher mercury, higher arsenic species by nature, completely independent of how clean, selective, or well-documented the actual fishing method behind it happens to be. Bumblebee solid white albacore in water. This is one of the 3 biggest, most recognizable tuna brands in the entire country, sitting on shelves in nearly every grocery store nationwide, and its specific albacore variety was directly included as part of Consumer Reports' mercury testing in 2023. Interestingly, Bumblebee's own chunk light variety, made by that exact same company, tested among the very lowest mercury levels recorded anywhere in the entire study, something we'll circle back around to later in this video. But that's precisely what makes flagging the albacore version here so worthwhile and so illustrative of the larger point. It's the same company, the same overall quality control standards, the same broad supply chain infrastructure, just a fundamentally different species of fish going into the can. And that species swap alone, nothing else, was enough on its own to push the recorded mercury level up by roughly 3-fold compared to its own sibling product sitting a few feet away on the same shelf. Star-kissed, solid white albacore tuna in water. This carries the exact same species-level concern as everything else covered in this stretch of the list: elevated mercury and elevated arsenic risk purely by virtue of being albacore. But Star-kissed's albacore product line specifically carries some additional baggage worth knowing about, baggage that has nothing to do with mercury at all. This particular product was one of the specific items named directly in a real, filed class action lawsuit, Hendricks versus Star-kissed, where a federal court ultimately found that Star-kissed's cans were consistently falling short of the federally mandated minimum weight of drained tuna per can, somewhere in the range of 2.84 to 3.23 ounces of actual tuna meat required inside a standard 5-ounce can under federal labeling regulations. Star-kissed ultimately agreed to settle that case for $12 million back in 2016, and remarkably, more than 2.4 million separate people ended up filing claims as part of that settlement, which at the time represented the largest number of individual claims ever submitted in a single class action lawsuit in American legal history. A follow-up lawsuit filed a couple years later made nearly identical allegations, this time specifically targeting Star-kissed's larger 12-ounce cans rather than the standard 5-ounce size. Star-kissed chunk, white, albacore tuna in water. And here's where the backstory behind this particular brand gets genuinely wild, well beyond anything related to mercury, arsenic, or can weights. Beyond the species-level concerns tied to albacore that we've already covered several times over, Star-kissed also happens to be the company that ended up paying the single largest fine in the entire recorded history of the American canned tuna industry, a full $100 million, which was the maximum penalty allowed under federal antitrust law after the company pleaded guilty back in 2018 to participating in a criminal price-fixing conspiracy. For years, spanning roughly from 2011 through 2013, Star-kissed and Bumblebee secretly coordinated with one another behind the scenes to keep tuna prices artificially inflated across the entire country, going so far as to meet privately in hotel rooms, deliberately using personal cell phones and private email accounts specifically to avoid leaving any kind of corporate paper trail that investigators might later uncover. The entire scheme only came apart because Chicken of the Sea's parent company, Thai Union, walked away from a planned merger with Bumblebee back in 2015, and in the course of that failed deal's due diligence process, discovered internal documents revealing exactly what had been going on between the competing companies. Rather than staying quiet, Thai Union went straight to federal investigators and turned the whole thing over voluntarily in exchange for full legal immunity. Bumblebee ultimately pleaded guilty as well and paid its own $25 million fine, and the combined financial fallout from the entire scandal, layered on top of existing debt, was significant enough that Bumblebee actually ended up filing for bankruptcy protection in 2019. When you add up the separate civil settlements that followed across the industry on top of the criminal fines, the total amount eventually paid back to consumers who had unknowingly been overcharged for years topped $216 million combined. We're about halfway through this entire list at this point. If you've made it this far, drop a comment down below, letting me know which of these specific cans is currently sitting somewhere in your pantry right now, because I'm genuinely curious how many of you are about to pause this video and go check your kitchen shelves. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, go ahead and hit that button, along with tapping the bell icon so you don't miss whatever deep dive into what's actually hiding in the food you're buying every week comes out next. Now let's get through the last couple of brands genuinely worth flagging here, and then move into the ones that actually do deserve a spot in your shopping cart going forward. Chicken of the sea chunk, white albacore, tuna in water. Out of every single brand-to-brand, albacore-to-light comparison that showed up across Consumer Reports' entire published study, this is the one specific number that stood out from all the rest by a wide margin. Chicken of the Sea's albacore tuna tested at roughly 10 times, not 3 times like most of the other brands. A full 10 times more mercury than that exact same brand's own chunk-light tuna sitting on the shelf right next to it. That gap is dramatically larger than any of the other 4 brands included in that same test showed between their own respective albacore and light product lines. It's worth pointing out here, in fairness to this particular brand, that Chicken of the Sea's parent company, Thai Union, was also the very whistleblower that originally broke open the entire price-fixing scandal we just walked through in detail and received full corporate immunity from prosecution as a direct result of coming forward voluntarily. So on the corporate honesty and accountability front, at least this brand genuinely comes out looking considerably better than either Starkist or Bumblebee ended up looking by comparison. But that 10 times mercury gap sitting specifically inside its albacore product line is real, independently measured and published, and it remains the single widest gap recorded anywhere in that entire study. And that brings us to the myth genuinely worth clearing up before we move into the picks that are actually worth spending your money on. Take a step back and notice something. Nothing we've covered on this entire list so far has had anything meaningful to do with which brand spent more money on marketing, which one prints "wild caught" across the front of its label in bold lettering, or which specific can cost $2 or $3 more than the one sitting right next to it on the shelf. Every single issue we've walked through traces back to exactly one simple fact printed directly on the front of the can in plain text. Does it say albacore or white tuna, or does it instead say chunk light or skipjack? That distinction is genuinely the entire story here. A cheap, no-frills store brand and an expensive, heavily marketed, sustainably sourced brand can both be albacore tuna, and if they are, they'll both carry roughly the same elevated mercury and arsenic risk profile, completely regardless of how much more you paid for the fancier one. Meanwhile, a completely ordinary, unremarkable chunk light can sitting on that exact same shelf, sometimes from the exact same company, can test dramatically lower on both fronts. The specific word you actually need to look for on that label isn't a certification logo, a sustainability seal, or a premium price tag at all. It's simply whether the can in your hand says light or white. So here's what those same 2 independent studies actually found sitting on the other side of that dividing line. Bumblebee Chunk Light tested among the lowest mercury levels recorded for any single product Consumer Reports checked across their entire study, and remarkably, it's also one of the cheapest options available anywhere in the entire tuna aisle, typically running around $1.22 at Walmart and about $1.39 at Target for a single standard-sized can. Chicken of the Sea Chunk Light landed in that same low mercury group as well, despite that same brand's albacore line testing as the single worst result recorded anywhere in the whole study, and it runs a similarly low price point, about $1.22 at Walmart and roughly $1.29 at Target. Starkist Chunk Light also made Consumer Reports' shortlist of the 4 specific tuna products they consider genuinely safe for regular, ongoing weekly consumption, up to about 12 ounces a week, roughly 3 standard cans, even for people who are actively watching and trying to limit their overall mercury intake for health reasons. And then there's the one product on this entire list that genuinely stands apart from everything else we've discussed. Safe Catch Wild Elite, specifically their skipjack tuna variety. This particular brand built its entire company identity and marketing message around one single, specific promise: that every individual fish that goes into every single can they produce gets tested for mercury on an individual basis before it's ever packaged, rather than relying on the occasional spot check testing approach that most of the rest of the canned tuna industry typically uses. Consumer Reports actually went and independently verified that specific claim during their testing, and confirmed that Safe Catch's recorded mercury levels genuinely were among the lowest of anything included in their entire study, directly corroborating exactly what the company had already been marketing to consumers all along, rather than exposing it as empty branding. Yes, it does typically cost noticeably more than the mainstream grocery store brands sitting nearby on the same shelf. But for the first time across this entire list, that extra cost is actually tied directly to something that's been independently measured and confirmed by outside testing, rather than simply resting on a nicer-looking label design or a more expensive-feeling can. So here, finally, is the actual answer to the question this whole video opened with. This was never really a straightforward story about which entire brand to trust wholesale and which one to avoid wholesale, because in most cases here, it's the exact same handful of major companies quietly making both the best performing and the worst performing products on this entire list, sometimes sitting directly next to each other on the same store shelf, occasionally even under the same brand name. It genuinely comes down to two specific words printed on the front of the can. Albacore, or white tuna, means meaningfully more mercury and more arsenic risk baked in, no matter how premium the branding looks, how much the fishing story tugs at your heartstrings, or how much extra you paid for it. Chunk light or skipjack means meaningfully less of both risks, and more often than not, it's actually the cheaper option sitting right next to the pricier one on that exact same shelf. And if you specifically want the version that's been independently verified through outside testing rather than one that's simply been marketed well, Safecatch's skipjack variety has real, published, third-party testing data standing behind that particular claim. Now I genuinely want to hear from you on this one. Did you already know that the species mattered more than the brand name before watching this video? Or is this the first time you're hearing it laid out this clearly? And be honest with yourself for a second. Which specific can is sitting in your pantry back home right now? Drop it down in the comments below. I want to know. If this video changed how you're planning to shop for tuna the next time you find yourself standing in that aisle, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more sitting quietly on grocery store shelves out there that genuinely deserves a second, much closer look before it ever ends up going into your cart out of pure habit.